It was supposed to be a routine flight from Paris to New York, but for Jamal it was about to turn into a nightmare. He arrived at the airport excited for his trip. Dressed sharply in a blue suit, Jamal was a tall, well-spoken man in his early 30s. As he approached the boarding gate, he noticed the sharp stares from the gate agents. The unease in their eyes told him everything he needed to know, a look he'd seen too many times. As he reached the counter to check in, a short, blonde-haired woman named Sandra looked him up and down, her eyes narrowing. "Sir," she said in a condescending tone, "are you sure you're in the right line?" Jamal felt the familiar sting of discrimination but kept his composure. "Yes, this is the priority boarding line. I have a first-class ticket." Sandra's lips twisted into a half-smile, as if she found his response amusing. "I see," she said slowly, "but we need to confirm your ticket and ID. Just standard procedure." She leaned over to her colleague, whispering something with a smirk. The line behind Jamal grew, and he could feel the weight of curious eyes on his back. Despite presenting both his ticket and ID, Sandra took an unusually long time to check them. She seemed to be stalling. "There's an issue with your ticket," she finally said, raising her voice just loud enough for everyone around to hear. "It seems invalid. Are you sure you booked it correctly?" Jamal's heart sank, but he remained calm. "Yes, I booked it through the airline's website. There shouldn't be a problem." Another gate agent, a man with thinning hair named Richard, chimed in. "We've been having issues with online scams lately," he said, glancing at Jamal as if he were some sort of con artist. "Let me see if I can figure this out." Other passengers were starting to murmur, some clearly growing impatient, while others stared at Jamal as if he didn't belong there. The subtle racism was unmistakable, but Jamal was used to it by now. Minutes passed, and Jamal was still standing there, humiliated and frustrated. Sandra and Richard were exchanging glances, their smug attitudes adding to the discomfort. Finally, Richard returned and said, "We've confirmed the ticket, but unfortunately, we've overbooked the flight, and there's no room left in first class. You'll need to be moved to economy." Jamal knew this was a lie. He glanced over at the first-class waiting area, where only a few people sat. "This is ridiculous," he said firmly. "I paid for first class. I'm not moving to economy just because you overbooked." Sandra crossed her arms. "Sir, if you don't want the seat, you're welcome to book another flight." The tension in the air was palpable, but before Jamal could respond, something unexpected happened. A young white woman, probably in her 20s, who had been quietly observing the situation, stood up from the first-class lounge. Her voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a sharp blade. "This is absurd. I've been watching how you've treated this man, and it's clear what's going on," she said, glaring at Sandra and Richard. "If there's no room in first class, then I'll give him my seat." A few gasps rippled through the crowd, and Jamal looked at her in disbelief. The gate agents, taken aback by the sudden outburst, fumbled for a response. "Miss, that's not necessary," Richard stammered, but the woman wouldn't back down. "Oh, it's necessary," she said sharply. "And I'm sure I'm not the only one who sees how you're treating him." One by one, other passengers began to chime in, some nodding in agreement, others murmuring in support. Another man, an older gentleman with a cane, stepped forward. "I'll give up my seat too if it means you stop this nonsense," he said. Sandra's face turned red, but before she could say anything, an airline supervisor arrived, alerted by the growing disturbance. "What seems to be the problem here?" the supervisor asked, surveying the scene. Without hesitation, Jamal explained everything: the deliberate delay, the condescending treatment, the lie about overbooking. The supervisor's face darkened as he listened. "I apologize for this," he said firmly, turning to Sandra and Richard. "This is unacceptable. Mr. Jamal, we'll ensure you're seated in first class, as you rightfully should be." Jamal finally felt a sense of relief, but the damage had been done. As he walked past the gate agents, he could see the anger in their eyes. They hadn't expected anyone to stand up to their veiled racism, and now they were being held accountable. However, what happened next took everyone by surprise. As Jamal settled into his first-class seat, he couldn't help but feel a sense of exhaustion. He was grateful for the passengers who had spoken up, but the entire experience left a bitter taste in his mouth. No matter how much he achieved, no matter how well-dressed or composed he was, the color of his skin was always a reason for people like Sandra and Richard to treat him differently. The plane took off, and the atmosphere seemed to settle. The supervisor had returned to Jamal's seat to apologize once more, offering complimentary services as compensation for the ordeal. But it was a hollow gesture. Jamal nodded politely, though his mind was still reeling from the humiliation. Just when he thought the worst was behind him, another twist occurred. Midway through the flight, Jamal noticed Sandra, the gate agent, boarding the plane. He was startled, wondering what she was doing on board. To his shock, she didn't approach him directly but instead headed towards the flight crew. Moments later, 2 flight attendants came over to Jamal, asking if they could speak with him in private. "We've been informed that there was an altercation before boarding," one of the attendants said hesitantly. "We're required to ask you to step aside for a moment." Jamal's heart sank. It seemed the situation hadn't been resolved after all. He was escorted to the back of the plane, where Sandra and Richard, along with the supervisor, were waiting. "Sir?" Sandra began, her voice dripping with faux politeness. "We have reason to believe you may have caused a disturbance at the gate. We've spoken to the airline and are considering filing a formal complaint against you." Jamal couldn't believe what he was hearing. The very people who had humiliated him were now trying to pin the blame on him, despite the passengers who had stood up in his defense. Before Jamal could respond, something remarkable happened. The young woman who had offered her seat earlier appeared in the aisle, followed by several other passengers from first class. "This is outrageous," she exclaimed. "We all saw what happened. You're not going to scapegoat him just to cover up your own discrimination." One by one, the passengers began speaking up, defending Jamal. The elderly man with the cane raised his voice as well. "I've been flying for decades, and I've never seen such blatant racism in my life. If anyone's filing a complaint, it should be us. Against you." The scene quickly escalated, with more passengers stepping forward to support Jamal. The flight crew, sensing the growing unrest, stepped back, unsure of how to handle the situation. The supervisor, clearly uncomfortable, tried to calm the crowd, but it was too late. Word had spread throughout the plane, and now everyone knew what was happening. "You can't silence all of us," the young woman said defiantly, staring directly at Sandra and Richard. "The truth will come out." Realizing they were outnumbered and outmatched, Sandra and Richard exchanged nervous glances. The supervisor, now fully aware of the severity of the situation, made a swift decision. "We're dropping this issue," he announced. "There will be no complaints filed. We sincerely apologize, Mr. Jamal." Jamal, though shaken, stood tall. The passengers around him had rallied behind him, something he had rarely experienced in situations like these. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up against the silent racism that so often went unchecked. As Jamal returned to his seat, the passengers in first class greeted him with warm smiles and nods of support. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. The plane landed hours later in New York, and as Jamal walked through the terminal, he noticed Sandra and Richard walking quickly in the opposite direction, their heads down. They had lost their power not just over Jamal, but over the situation. Before heading to baggage claim, Jamal turned to the young woman who had been the first to stand up for him. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "You didn't have to do what you did, but it meant the world to me." She smiled. "Sometimes doing nothing is the real crime. I wasn't going to let that happen." Jamal left the airport that day with more than just his luggage. He carried with him a sense of hope that while racism might never fully disappear, there were still good people willing to fight against it, no matter the cost. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about real-life challenges and triumphs, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Stay tuned for more powerful stories.